and I started doing counseling within the church, and I'm watching the way that women are being counseled. You have to submit to him as long as he's not asking you to sin. And so what I saw happening to these women as a result of that kind of counsel was more oppression. The church was adding to oppression. Again, broke my heart. So in 2015, I just finally said, I put a post on Facebook. Is anybody interested in starting a domestic violence ministry? I don't know what else I said in that post, but 12 people showed up at my office.
Welcome to the Eden Podcast, where we true the verse of Genesis 3:16, and we discover that God didn't curse Eve or Adam or limit woman in any way.
This is True Talk Tuesday. Welcome to the Eden Podcast. I'm Bruce C.E. Fleming, Executive Director of the True 316 Foundation. Our website is tru316.com. That's true316.com. Mimi is our co-host for this True Talk Tuesday, and I'd like to have you, Mimi, would you introduce our special guest?
Absolutely. Joy Forrest is from North Carolina. She is the founder and executive director of Call to Peace Ministries. She authored Call to Peace, a survivor's guide to finding peace and healing after domestic abuse. Joy holds a Master of Arts in Biblical Counseling from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary and has been active in counseling ministry since 2005. She has been an advocate for victims of abuse since 1997. Welcome to the Eden Podcast, Joy.
Thank you, Mimi. It's so great to be here.
Joy, we've gotten to know each other through Facebook and your staff members and the Facebook live shows. And I noticed you're traveling all over the place. So we're excited to introduce your stories to our listeners and viewers of the Eden Podcast. Can you start with your faith story, please?
Oh, absolutely. I have a pretty dramatic faith story. My dad was actually a pastor when I was a child in a very, we will say, liberal denomination. It was definitely not evangelical, and I knew that Jesus existed. I believed in him. I loved what I knew of him, but I never heard the gospel. And so as I was growing up, my dad ended up leaving the ministry. We were basically living in a small southern town, and he preached a pro-civil rights sermon, and we got run out of town by the Klan. So after that, I really didn't want to be a Christian. It was the early 1970s, hippie movement was going on. So I dropped out and did all the things that the hippies were doing, ran away from home. But my dad found me about 2 weeks later, brought me back home, and it was pretty ridiculous. He's like, "What do you want?" I'm like, "I just want to be free, man." So at that point, he said, "Okay, I'll let you be free." He said, "But I'm not going to promote whatever your freedom looks like." He says, "I will give you rides to school and church." And so after that, I really had no way to get anywhere. So I ended up going to a church camp, and at that church camp, the pastor of the same denomination handed me a New Testament. He said, "Joy, I'd love to see you give your life to Jesus." Well, I had never heard it in those words. And I felt so empty. I had been dabbling in the occult on top of everything else and just felt so much darkness around me all the time. And so I started reading the book of Matthew. And as I started reading, I got so excited about Jesus. And I'm going, look at this. He hated the religious hypocrisy, just like I hate it. And so at the end of the week, the pastor gave this like an altar call. Even in this non-evangelical church, I went down weeping, "Lord, I've messed up my life. I want to give it to you." And so that night when I went to bed and went to sleep or to go to sleep, it was pure darkness out there because we were in the country, no city lights, and I felt surrounded by the light. It just was an immediate difference that I felt. And so my life was different after that. I needed some discipling, and the Lord made sure that he put people in my life to disciple me. And so I'm just so grateful. I mean, I really feel it when Paul says that he transformed us, and he transformed us into from darkness into light. And I just feel that in my life so much, so strongly. He really made a difference for me. Still does.
Well, so I kind of want to know what happened after that. So tell us your ministry story. How did you go from camp to founding your Called to Peace Ministries?
Well, actually, about a month after I became a Christian, I met a young man. I was actually just about to turn 15. I was a very deep thinking teenager, right? So I had already read things on all the religions. But I met this guy, and he was a little bit older than me, and I was just so amazed that he took interest in me. I thought he was really good looking. He had a rock band, and so we got involved. And within a week or two, I started seeing he's pretty jealous. Had a lot of jealousy, and then I started hearing his story. He grew up with abuse, and he hated it. And I kind of felt sorry for him. So I really don't think I can tell you everything that I need to tell you in such a short segment. But bottom line is that over time, he would blow up about something, and I would go, "Oh, I won't do that again." We ended up dating all through high school and college. I actually tried to break up with him one time because he told me that I was some kind of religious Jesus freak, and people would thinking how crazy I was. And I'm like, I don't care. So I broke up with him. And then, I don't know, 3 or 4 days later, he came back and he had a bunch of tracts and said, let's go hand out tracts, and acted like he was a Christian. And so, then after that, he talked the Christianese and started going to church with me. But I'm not sure I ever saw a full, he certainly didn't have the type of conversion that I had. But we did stay together all throughout high school, college, and then got married after he graduated from college. He started a year before me and finished 2 years later. So, but after we had gotten married, the economy was not very good, and so we ended up selling our car and going back to graduate school. And he did not do real well in his program. He was having a personality conflict with the director of his program, some kind of science program. And so he would keep me up late at night just telling me how terrible his life was, and most of it was my fault, or I was too stupid to see what was going on. And he just constant verbal assault, and not even letting me go to sleep. I couldn't leave the room, and I couldn't get any sleep. I was up till 3 a.m., couldn't study, and then I had to be at school at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so that started happening to the point that I thought, I can't do this anymore. So finally one night I told him, I'm done. I am just done. I'm leaving. And when I did that, I found myself up against the wall, and he was kicking my belly repeatedly. So that was the first time we separated. Well, a couple of weeks after that, I found out that I was pregnant. I didn't tell him at first because I was so scared of him. I'd gotten a protective order. And even in all the time we'd been together at that point, it was 11 years, he had never physically harmed me until I said I was going to leave. And so we ended up getting back together after 7 months. He seemed to have changed. But later on, I found that it was not a genuine change. He had done all the right things, said all the right things. And this kind of pattern happened on and off over the years, up until at the very end, because we do know that with domestic abuse, it's progressive over time. And at the very end, it just became life-threatening. I really thought that he was going to kill me. And so I ended up escaping, coming back to North Carolina, where I grew up, and found a job down here. He had actually gone to medical school and had become a doctor and was making really good money. And yet, and we looked great on the outside, but on the inside, our house was a mess. What was going on? I was living in constant fear. So, when I was 15 and I met him and he did something that I thought, oh, I'll never do that again. Well, by the time I'm 38 at this point, and I'm thinking there's like 1,000 things that I'm thinking I will not do that anymore. So I'm basically living in constant fear of this man. And honestly, he became the functional Lord of my life. It's not that I was bowing down in worship to him, but I didn't believe in divorce. And I was just living in so much fear of him that I couldn't serve the Lord the way I had wanted to in my earlier days. So losing this freedom, and my mind just got so warped, and I started even questioning God's goodness. I questioned who I was in him, even though I was all along serving in ministry. And so Finally, when I got out, again, it was very dangerous. But when I got out, I had an encounter with him one day where he tried to run us off the road head on when I was driving towards him in traffic one day. And I said, Lord, if you help me live through this, I will help other women who are in these situations. And sure enough, and that's what happened. As soon as I got out and came back to North Carolina, by that point, now I stayed another year trying to work the marriage out, and it just kept getting worse. And so when I came back to North Carolina, I got into this church and I was in a women's Sunday school class. And well, there were women in my class who were going through abuse. So I started helping immediately. And then in year 2000, I had to help a woman get out. I took her up to the domestic violence shelter and told them a little bit of my story. And they said, hey, we would love to have you come and speak at our candlelight vigil to honor survivors of domestic violence. And I thought, I don't speak in public. And yet I knew God had not brought me through all he had brought me through. So I went and spoke. And that led them to call me a few weeks later and offer me a job as their spokesperson. So I tell people that God put me there to be stretched. And so we did that. I stayed there for about a year and a half, and I saw Christian women walking in going, why does my pastor care more about my marriage than my life? Why doesn't my pastor see what this is doing to my children? And so it just broke my heart to watch. And then in 2004, God called me to seminary in a way I've never experienced before. I knew nothing about the seminary here, but I had this sense I needed to take a counseling class. So I went over to sign up for this counseling class and found out it was a biblical counseling program. I wasn't familiar with it. And when I got into it, it's a pretty, back then it was nouthetic counseling. It was not always the most helpful to people because it does focus on taking responsibility for our own sin. And for the most part, victims that I was dealing with at the time were told to look at their sin, and that does not help when you're going through abuse. So once again, and I started doing counseling within the church, and I'm watching the way that women are being counseled. You have to submit to him as long as he's not asking you to sin. And so what I saw happening to these women as a result of that kind of counsel was more oppression. The church was adding to oppression. Again, broke my heart. So in 2015, I just finally said, I put a post on Facebook. Is anybody interested in starting a domestic violence ministry? I don't know what else I said in that post, but 12 people showed up at my office on a Saturday morning. Yeah. And that was the beginning.
Wow.
Of Call to Peace Ministries. So, yep.
So now you're a bigger ministry now. You've got a dozen people on your staff. How many do you have now?
Yeah, I think they're 12 or 13. We also have some contractors. Yeah.
I'm curious. You mentioned at one point early on you needed to add a guy to the staff. Can you tell us about that? Why that happened?
So this is how it's happened with Call to Peace all along. I will get this notion that it keeps coming to me, and in the beginning, I ignored those notions like, oh yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, I found out that when I paid attention to it, things started happening. So I started having this idea that I need to hire a pastor because I was going into churches and I was advocating for victims of abuse in their churches. And because I went to the seminary here, sometimes they would receive me well because there were so many, mostly every church that I was going to, there were some people that had connections with the seminary. However, it's like I felt like I was just missing the mark. I couldn't quite get through to them. And I kept having this thought, I should hire a pastor. I should hire a pastor to talk to these other pastors. And finally, I reached out to one that was on our board at the time, Jim Upchurch. And I said, hey, Jim, would you be interested in working with Call to Peace for maybe just 5 hours a week or something? He goes, well, actually, I just talked to my church about going bivocational. He pastors a very small church, and at the time, I don't think it was making a whole lot of money, so he was willing to do it, and it really started to make a difference when a pastor reached out to other pastors so they could relate to one another. And so that started our church partnership program, which has grown by leaps and bounds since then. Dan Beck, who also came on board maybe a couple of years later, he has his own story of dealing with domestic abuse in the church. And he has gone full time, and we're just reaching out to not just one church at a time like we did when I was doing it, but whole denominations. And I'm just really impressed that the work that he and Andre Turrentine, who are pastors on our staff, are doing. But we also have probably a dozen pastors and counselors and other volunteers working with that program.
So then you get a church to have you come in and make a several-hour presentation. What do you tell them? What do you teach them?
I always tell people we teach them to do no harm. So what we do is we have a 4 hour. It's really kind of just like a very short intro. It's not going to teach them how to do this very well, maybe. But it will teach them what the signs to look for, things to look for. What does domestic abuse look like? How do you respond? How do you not respond? What are the myths? Because so many people believe the myths of domestic abuse. Like the woman, it's basically two people that are fighting. They don't understand that that's not the dynamic at all. We're looking at one person who has way more power in the relationship than the other. He's consistently using it to promote usually himself. And so we teach them about those dynamics. We teach them what to look for. We talk to them about the victim dynamics, because most victims of abuse are experiencing some kind of post-traumatic stress. And so a lot of times they don't present really well. We've been wondering for over the years, like, how is it the pastors half the time wouldn't believe the women when they would go to them? I saw that in my counseling ministry, like they didn't believe what she was saying. But as I started paying attention to trauma, I realized she doesn't know how to present what's going on very well because of her trauma. She's just all over the map sometimes trying to explain what's going on, and it makes it very difficult. And so this is where advocacy comes in really handy. I think in 2018, I had 4 people in about a 4-month period ask me if I would teach an advocacy training. And I was an advocate with the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. But I thought, I don't have time to write a curriculum. I had already written the curriculum for our support groups, and we were getting too busy for anything like that. So finally, when the 4th person asked me, I said, Lord, if you want me to do this, then you're just going to have to make it happen. Well, about a month later, this woman reaches out to me, Dr. Deborah Wingfield, who was a professor at Colorado State University Pueblo. She walks into my office and said, Joy, I've got 30 courses that I've written on domestic violence and advocacy. I was like, what? And I said, well, I've got people who want to learn. And so I said, if you will let me add a scripture or a faith-based perspective to it, I have people. And so that was, I think in the fall of 2018, we started the classes in 2019. And I think we're nearing 800 people that have gone through some or most of those classes. We have 12 classes over the course of a year. And it's really a very, I would say, comprehensive training. But in addition to that, we will walk alongside those people as they're learning, as they're practicing advocacy in their own worlds, and even for Call to Peace Ministries now, because we have volunteer advocates that work for us or work with us. And so we basically are there to provide support for them. But that advocacy training led to a whole program in Call to Peace Ministries. And actually, even the church partnership program kind of came out of that, because the pastors, Jim had already taken our advocacy training. And so a lot of pastors have gone through that training as well.
So I'm dropping a few balls here. I'm trying to get a good picture. So what we're going to do is we're going to put links in the show notes, and so people can follow up and check and see all the different things that you're doing. But I see Mimi, she's ready. She's got a zinger or two here. I will let you follow up. Go ahead, Mimi.
Well, Joy, the work you're doing is just so important. And I happened to see Jim interviewed on your website on a video, and he stated how he was originally doing more harm because he didn't understand the dynamics when abuse is involved. So you've already answered some of the questions in what you're doing, but there's such a need to reformulate the typical Christian marriage model when abuse is involved, and it's a factor in there. So it's great what you're doing with pastors, church leaders, lay counselors, that a lot of them don't understand that dynamic. And so it sounds like you're equipping them and you're training them. And so has the response been good? And is it been, really eye-opening to them to realize
Oh, yeah.
there's a different dynamic? And boy, we really need to get that continue to spread.
Yes, I get so excited doing these trainings. So when I first started doing it, when I was working at the domestic violence shelter in the year 2000 and 2001, I tried to do a kind of a training for pastors, and nobody showed up. I mean, we did everything in our power. I had one pastor show up, and it was the one I invited to pray. So it has been amazing. And I think that in the last 4 to 5 years, I don't know if it was the Me Too movement, I don't know what's done it, but we do have way more interaction with pastors. I'm very pleased to say that it feels like the tide is turning in some churches. I think there will always be churches that will refuse to get it, and there will be so patriarchal that they're hurting women, and we can't make a difference there, but we are making a difference for a lot of churches, and a lot of conservative evangelical churches are inviting us in to do training, because I believe that it's a biblical mandate to take care of those who are oppressed. And so this is what we see abuse as: oppression, which is a biblical category that we need to understand, and we need to, I think, emulate God's heart for the people who are oppressed. And so it's been beautiful to watch. I've seen so many pastors go, everybody needs to know this stuff. So
yes.
it's
And it's
beautiful.
great pastors reaching out to pastors, and
Yes,
so
yes.
it's a great work you're doing. So it's so needed. I also, besides co-hosting, run the workshops for True 316. And so many of our students, they are both women and men, but come having had an experience of some type of domestic abuse, that they've heard our message and find a lot of freedom in the scriptures that they've normally been taught are saying one thing, and that God is telling them one thing through these scriptures. So we at True 316 are trying to true the verse and get what God is really saying through the language of Hebrew or Greek and through the literary patterns, and really what the scriptures are saying. But in our correspondence recently, you said how the True 316 message is already making a difference in some of the ladies' lives that you're around. So could you share a little bit more about that?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of the women that we work with have had scripture twisted and used against them. I know that happened with me, and I also twisted it myself. I think I twisted it against myself. The way I read everything was really not helpful to me as a person. I had come to believe that my husband had like this superiority, he was superior to me, and that he had authority over me, and that I had to bow down in obedience. And I really thought that's what it meant. And in fact, I had to untwist a lot of scriptures for myself coming out of it. It's interesting. The seminary that I went to, there was a couple that did some research on Genesis, and somebody asked them, "What were you surprised about?" And they said, "The mutuality." I'm very conservative. Both professors, both have their doctorate, and I was like, yeah. So it is a beautiful thing to know that God did not create us to be subservient to another person, that we are supposed to be serving him. And when you're subservient to a person like I was, you can't be fully subservient to or a servant of God. You cannot please both God and man, especially a man who is trying to hurt you. So it has been really such a breath of fresh air just to relook at scripture. And so what you guys are doing is so important for people who have experienced abuse. They need to untwist these scriptures that have been twisted against them. So I'm just really grateful that we found you.
Yes.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
We've been talking to Joy Forrest, founder of the Called to Peace Ministries, and it's just a start of our online relationship with you. We're really glad to be able to share your stories, Joy. Keep it up. Yay, team. Let's go. We're excited about this. May you continue to grow, and churches need to listen as we knock on their doors. So we're going to thank you for that, and we'll come back maybe another time soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
True 316 Foundation is the home of the Eden Podcast. Join us for $3.16 a month or more. Let's true the verses on the key passages on women and men. Go to true316.com/partner.